we don't deny that if properly qualified and authorized by Srila Prabhupada, his followers can also become actual and regular gurus of their own separate ashrams. I'll give more information about that in the main presentation. We know for a fact that someday, maybe this year, or maybe 10,000 years in the future, Srila Prabhupada will give his order to the next qualified person to become the next authorized and bona fide acharya. But until then, for within his ISKCON mission, it was and still is Prabhupada's most wonderful and merciful desire to continue to take direct disciples, even though he is no longer physically present. That is the conclusion that many of Prabhupada's disciples and followers have reached. This presentation has been made to offer a detailed analysis of the related events, evidences, both hard evidences and circumstantial. Even though it is now 43 years since His Divine Grace physically departed from this world, to this date, not that many members of ISKCON have any knowledge of the events that I've related, or will some of the events that I'll relate. I myself wasn't aware of the details either on this issue for so many long decades. Not many of us have taken the time to investigate on our own with an open and unbiased mindset the actual arguments that support the Ritvik Ras side. Ritvik Ras, it's a word I use, Ras, means the Ritvik representative of the Acharya system. So one of the main reasons why many devotees haven't investigated this on their own is because the GBC have labeled this idea as totally bogus and deviant. The fact is, the vast majority of members of ISKCON want to be good devotees. They want to be good devotees in good standing with the authorized leadership of ISKCON. Srila Prabhupada had instructed that the GBC was to be the ultimate authority for ISKCON in his absence. Since the GBC has declared this as totally bogus, many have felt the safest thing for them to do is simply accept these conclusions given by the GBC. For many, they feel this is too complex of an issue for them to try and figure out on their own. And then do what if they conclude the GBC is wrong? Wind up creating waves and get kicked out? So they've chosen to take the safest course of action and just not get involved on this issue and just accept the guidance of the GBC leadership. Most feel this is simply above their pay grade, so they leave it to their authorities, who they trust have reached the right and proper conclusions. And the fact is, that attitude and course of action by the majority is in fact the proper and best course of action for such devotees to take who have not got the time or the facility to make their own assessment of this issue, or the fortitude or stomach to deal with it if they reach the conclusion the GBC has been wrong. But now I am making all of this information available so that it will be easier for everyone to become aware of the evidences, the events that took place, etc. So devotees can reach their own educated conclusions. Hold this thought, though, as I will come back to this point shortly about accepting and following the GBC. There's a lot to cover on this topic. I have broken things down to the following main categories, not in any specific order. They are, the fundamental or philosophical questions. The main one being, is this ongoing Ritvik representative system of initiations, after the Acharya has passed from this world, still bona fide, or is it fundamentally against the principles of Scripture? Number two is, what did Srila Prabhupada really instruct? Which path did he really want us to traverse? And number three, and if in fact His Divine Grace did want us to continue on the Ritvik representative path, then how did the GBC wind up taking us down the wrong path? Was there some sinister conspiracy, or were the original decisions on this issue based on misunderstandings and unfortunate mistakes and errors? Excuse me, we have partly dealt with that here in the introduction. However, more will be presented in the main sections. To address these issues and their many sub-issues, I have broken the presentation into two main sections. To deal with category one, that is the fundamental or philosophical questions, I have chosen to tackle this side of the issue by telling my own personal story of how I went from supporting the GBC's multi-guru system and opposing the Ritvik system, the Ritvik representative of the Acharya or after Samadhi system, to slowly coming to accept that the GBC was wrong and that the Ritvik representative system was the system that Srila Prabhupada, for a fact, wanted us to follow and still wants us to follow. I have titled this section, My Personal Story. I will tell my story. As I tell my story, I will be sharing with you the analytical path I took, the personal struggles as I grappled with the philosophical aspects, as I came to terms with the realization that Srila Prabhupada actually wanted us to take the Ritvik system path. I will share the logical arguments I assessed both for and against the two paths. And also important is that included in my personal story is my personal experience with an incident involving Srila Prabhupada and the handful of GBC men that took place in just the month before Srila Prabhupada's disappearance. This incident affected me traumatically and became a major factor in how I dealt with this issue even over 20 years afterwards. This incident is one that has similar overtones to the one regarding how the handful of GBC men disobeyed Srila Prabhupada's request and didn't mail out the July 9th letter. So in my personal story, I share my own personal experience about that incident. However, in the chronological timeline, I will also provide evidences that this incident did, in fact, take place. And of course, the other major section of this presentation I call the chronological timeline section. Actually, my personal story is also told in a chronological fashion, but the focus is on my own experiences of events and that relate to this issue, told from my own perspective. But in the chronological timeline, the most important aspect of that section is that we focus on Srila Prabhupada, what he actually said and didn't say. On this issue, I begin from April of 1977 until his departure in November of 77. In-depth analysis is given regarding the May 28th meeting and the July 9th letter as well. The chronological timeline then continues on highlighting the early decisions and the path the GBC took regarding this issue. Other shorter sections aside from those two major sections are this introduction and a short section where I will give my concluding statements. I will be making also a section on the direction of management. Direction of management is the title Srila Prabhupada gave to the formal paper he wrote by which he created and formed the GBC. This paper was written and executed in July of 1970. It is a most important document for ISKCON. The direction of management, or DOM, Srila Prabhupada provides the basic structure of the GBC, and he gives the most vital and important provisions of a checks and balance system for the GBC. He specified that every 3 years, the GBC was to decide which 1/3 of their members were to remain as GBC for the next term. And yes, he gave terms for the GBC, 3-year terms. Then the temple presidents were to meet and hold a vote on the fate of the other 2/3 members. I think it was 2/3 or 1/4. You'll see in that section. But if the temple presidents assess that those members, the other 2/3 or 3/4, were not doing their GB services well, the temple presidents, will vote. If they saw they're doing well, then the temple presidents will vote for them to remain in their position. However, if the temple presidents find that some of the GBC did not perform their services up to expectations, then every 3 years they can hold this vote and replace those who they feel are not doing their duty properly. The temple presidents were to select new members for the GBC from amongst themselves, from amongst the temple presidents. Many devotees on seeing Srila Prabhupada's original system see it as such a good system and a needed system in ISKCON. It provides a means for checks and balances, which has been totally missing in the current system. And it is Srila Prabhupada's own system. It's not a concoction. It's not trying to invent something and trying to make it work. It is Prabhupada's original plan. But the GBC have sharply rejected that system, and they try to claim that Srila Prabhupada had just let it go and never implemented it. He just lost interest. But a lot of us totally disagree with that assessment. Rather, we see that it was the GBC who never implemented it. And in fact, when we read it and we get into it, we can see that the elections weren't supposed to really take place until after Prabhupada leaves, because Prabhupada was still here. He said in the direction of management, he will be giving the ongoing guidance. He will be selecting, he will be adding to the members of the GBC. So at that point, there was no need for the terms and the limits and the temple presidents. But regardless, it is a system that it is the system, the only really system that Srila Prabhupada gave for how the GBC was to be managed and how they were to function and having term limits. So many of us would like to see that implemented. I will go into all that in detail in that section, as well as giving argument for and why that system should be adopted. There are a number of ancillary notes. Ancillary notes are separate subsections or notes where I either present additional arguments or additional supporting evidence in more details on a particular point that is made in the main body of the presentation. For example, there is an ancillary note on my use of the acronym that I have coined for this issue, Ritvik Ras. Ritvik is not the subject of this presentation. Some call this the Guru issue. However, the most common word the devotees use to refer this issue has become the word Ritvik, the Ritvik issue. And yes, I also chose to use that word in the title of this presentation and as the name for the hosting website. I did so not because I support referring to this issue, but just that name alone, but because that is the name that most members of ISKCON identify with this issue, and it's the name they will use when they do an online search on this issue. But as I will explain, technically, this is not actually a Ritvik issue at all. The actual meaning of the Sanskrit word Ritvik means a Brahmin priest who is qualified to perform Vedic yajna. That's it. That's all it means. A Brahmin priest who is qualified to perform Vedic yajna. In the Sanskrit language and the Vedic culture, the word Ritvik is reserved for the most qualified Brahmins. Therefore, the word conveys great respect. Isn't it an exalted honor to be called a Ritvik in Vedic culture? Srila Prabhupada knew Sanskrit, and he understood and used the word properly. Therefore, this issue is not about Ritviks, the Brahmins who perform Vedic sacrifice. Although it's a little bit, because those Ritvik representatives who Srila Prabhupada, actually the title he gave was Ritvik representatives of the Acharya. This is the title he bestowed upon those persons who would perform the initiation ceremonies on his behalf. So in that sense, they are to be Brahmin Ritviks, but this is not about Brahmin Ritviks. This is specifically about Ritvik representatives of the Acharya. And that is how I came up with the acronym of Ritvik Ras, Ritvik representative of the Acharya system. For more details, see the ancillary note, the Ritvik Ras, or titled Ritvik Ras. Another ancillary note that I would recommend that you watch at this time is entitled Just Follow the GBC. Now, by the way, there'll be links down here for that ancillary notes, and when they come up, you type on it, you hit it, you click on it, it'll pause this presentation, where you are, and it'll play the new ancillary note. When it's done with that, it'll come back to this where you left off. So that's how those work. Or you can, I think there'll be a selection to play later, and it'll build up a list for you of things you want, if you have cookies enabled on your browser and you use the same system. I'll get more into that. Anyway, another ancillary note, like I was saying, was has entitled, Just Follow the GBC. Previously, a few minutes ago, I asked you to hold your thoughts about how the supporters of the Ritwik system have been at a disadvantage in presenting their side of this issue, because the GBC hold the post of authority, and they have ruled that this Ritwik aspect is bogus and deviant. And the ancillary note, Follow the GBC, I have explained that following our authority, the GBC, is the right thing to do in most all situations. However, in this ancillary note, I cite the example of Bali Maharaj, who, when he knew with all certainty that his spiritual authority, his own guru, was wrong, he rejected his guru's guidance. Millions of years later, we still glorify Bali Maharaj for those very same actions of actually rejecting his authority. Also given in that the ancillary note are two other examples that I give. One is where Srila Prabhupada rebuked disciples who refused to accept their GBC as their authority, because that GBC man had a personal fall down. Srila Prabhupada actually told the devotees who rejected, they absolutely rejected to accept that GBC member as their authority. Prabhupada actually disowned them as his disciples. He got very upset, and he actually disowned them for not following the GBC. But then I give one other example where a GBC had a fall down, but I explained it was different. It wasn't just a personal fall down. It involved a lot of other devotees, the deities, so many things. And Prabhupada became angry with the devotees who did not reject the guidance given by that GBC. He actually became angry that they did not reject their authority. So this is a very critical point for devotees to consider about when and how, or at what point should we reject our authority. Mostly we follow the GBC. We want that standard, obviously. But if we know for a fact they are wrong, Prabhupada, if you knew for a fact that GBC who was telling them to do the wrong thing, and they knew that for a fact, they admitted to Prabhupada that they knew that, but they were following because he was the GBC, Prabhupada became angry at them for not rejecting that GBC. So anyway, this is a very critical point, and for devotees to consider individually, and I address that issue in this ancillary note, Follow the GBC.